Sundering is a book series which was created by R.A. Salvatore, or Bob Salvatore, and Ed Greenwood in an attempt to revitalize the realms. So far on Bombard Radio, we've had R.A. Salvatore talking about his book The Companions, then we had Paul S. Kemp talking about The Godborn, Aaron M. Evans, The Adversary, Richard Lee Byers, The Reaver, and now we have Troy Denning returning to the show for the second time to talk about The Sentinel. While earlier, I guess we had Troy Denning on in October to talk about Star Wars books. It's an excellent interview. You guys should all go check it out. But now he's back to talk about Book 5 of The Sundering. This series has been going on for, well, since August, and there are 6 books total. The 6th one will be Ed Greenwood's book. Book 5 of The Sundering not only continues the tale, but also introduces a brand new character into the realms. The character is Cleef Kenrick, a paladin created by Troy Denning in his return to the realms, something that he hasn't written in since 2002. In the meantime, of course, all his fans know him. Well, he was writing Star Wars. He had 12 years of writing Star Wars, and now he's back to the Forgotten Realms. Not only is this Book 5 of The Sundering, the series which is changing Dungeons & Dragons on D&D 4 to D&D 5, or Next as it's called, but also continues the overall plot of the series. This book is going to be available on Amazon.com April 1st, and you can order it through our Amazon link. Right now it is available for pre-orders. It's hardcover, Kindle, and mass market paperback, and I know it'll also be available on Audible, Unabridged, which you can get by starting your free audio trial through Audible. You can go to audibletrial.com/bombardradio and sign up for your free 30-day trial today and get a free book in the process. It could be The Sentinel. So, without further ado, let's welcome back Troy Denning to Bombard Radio as we talk about Book 5 of The Sundering, The Sentinel. So you're writing the next book in The Sundering, Book 5, The Sentinel. So what can you tell us about the story of The Sentinel? What exactly is the basic storyline for this book?
Well, it's basically works on 2 levels. It's a story of forbidden love between a embittered paladin who has spent his whole life worshiping a dead god, and some other people, a priestess of love, named Joelle Emmeline, and a young aristocrat named Arietta Seasilver, and they find themselves kind of thrown together on a quest to help prevent Shar from hatching her plan to gain control of Torel after all. So.
Okay, so this is book 5 out of 6, and I heard early on that you requested to write one of the later books in the series for your return in the Forgotten Realms. What was the reason for wanting to write one of the later books rather than, I don't know, probably one of the easier, say, storyline-wise of the earlier ones?
Well, it was mostly a matter of scheduling, because I usually find myself scheduled out about 3 to 4 years ahead of where I'm I usually have contracts for 3 to 4 years ahead of where I'm at, and in order to be able to contribute to The Sundering, I had to take one of the later books in the series so that I would have time to finish up the stuff that was already under contract and be able to fit it into my schedule. So that was a primary motivation. I also like to come in toward the end and tie all the work with tying strings together and pulling things together. I enjoy that a little bit more than doing setup. So those 2 reasons were kind of why I just popped in at the end.
Well, that makes sense, especially since you're, lots of work on Star Wars. That's exactly what you did in a lot of those series is, excuse me, you combine a bunch of, storylines together and either wrapped them up or moved them in a new direction. So I guess the next question will be, you haven't written Forgotten Realms for 12 years, and in the meantime, you've pretty much been writing Star Wars. How has your experience writing Star Wars helped you with your return to the realms? Has it affected you in any way? It changed the direction you look at writing? How has it helped or affected you in the meantime?
Well, I think one of the things that happens is just a little bit of distance away from anything. When you've done, worked hard at any kind of a thing, whether it's basketball or judo or writing or, poetry or painting, you do it and you work hard on it and you improve and you improve. But there comes a point when you'll find yourself stepping away for, time reasons or possibly an injury or possibly, you just need to do something else for a while. And I've noticed, because I've done that several times with different things, and I noticed that when you come back to it, something happens in your mind which crystallizes what you were doing before. And so when you come back to it, you have a little fresher perspective, but also I think a little deeper insight into it, and it feels somewhat more natural to do that. And I certainly noticed that with coming back to the realms, although there were elements that were a little bit strange to me because I had not been writing in the realms, of course, during the whole era that preceded the Sundering, when we had the predominance of the planar elements kind of coming in and making Abertorel such a kind of, I don't know quite what the term is, but darker, grittier place than it had been when I had last written in it.
So did you, how did they get you up to date on, like, I guess it'd be D&D 4.0 or the Spell Plague and so on, or Age of Upheaval, I think would be the proper term. But how did they get you up to date on that? Did you just sit there with Ed Greenwood and Salvatore and just discuss this, or were you actually keeping up to date on Forgotten Realms in case you had, wanted to return later?
Well, I had been I hadn't been keeping up to date on it. I'd been, touching bases on it, reading something here and there. But not really, staying completely immersed in the world. And so when Bob called me and said they wanted to talk to me about, a new story idea, I went back and looked at it a little bit, and I saw, wow, they had really changed a lot more than I had expected. So I kind of just started reading from that point on, whatever I could find, and then once we had the meetings, I said, okay, now, and I knew what I would be writing and where I'd be writing it. I said, okay, let's focus on what particular things I should be reading, looking at, and of course, got the latest version of the Forgotten Realms, was it 4.0? And
yeah, 4.0 was the most recent one, and now it's moving into, 5 or next, whatever they're calling it.
Yeah, I don't know what they're going to call it. But anyway, I got the version that preceded that and read that, and started reading through there and trying to see where I felt like I could fit in and what I could do with it, and, and work, and not only where I could fit in, the way I write and the things that I like to write, but also how it would fit into the whole Sundering arc that we had already planned. So it was a little bit of a steady process, but I enjoy that stuff. I kind of like to come back and read. I'm a fantasy reader anyway, of Star Wars and fantasy reader, science fiction. So it was just a matter of saying, oh, okay, well, I should read this book instead of that book. This book is actually going to have impact on my work, and that one's just for fun.
So being that your last book in the Realms came out in 2002, and since then, we've had the Age of Upheaval with D&D 4 and the Spell Plague and all this stuff. Did you find it difficult to begin writing your new story, get the initial start, or was it, as you said, it was refreshing, with new ideas? Was it easier or harder to actually get this one started since it's been so long?
It was actually a little bit harder to get it started. Just because even though when I started writing the book, I had a pretty firm idea of the flavor and of what I wanted to do, and had in my imagination anyway, the way I wanted to kind of bring my style to where the world was at the time that when my book was going to be released. But I found that there were so many little details that I needed to really nail down, I'd have to, even the Shadowar, which I think I was the first guy to write about them, I had to go back and see what had been done with them since, and and what exactly their abilities were, and despite that effort, in my first draft, I had actually confused. I can't even remember what it was I had confused, but I confused some terms on the shadow bar and had them acting inappropriately. So I had to fix that. So there was a lot of little stuff like that, and mostly just the attention to detail that is required. You say, well, I want to write a story about that includes a shadow bar prince. Well, that even though I'm the guy who actually gave the shadow bar prince his name and invented the 12 sons or the 12 princes, a lot had been done with them since, and I had to come up to date with all of that, learn all of the specifics, and that was really what, I don't want to call it a headache, but that was time consuming, and I felt like I needed to tread very carefully to try not to inadvertently undo something that had been done while I was gone.
I know we found this with Richard Lee Byers, but did you find yourself wanting to use, or frequently using, like the older names for some of these characters and gods and lands? Because I know he used it for the God of Light, the Anometer, whatever it's called. He's used a lot in Kemp's novel and Aaron Evans' novel, but Byers, he was using the name that existed, in the 90s, the early name. Did you find yourself wanting to use like a lot of the older terms and so on for some of these characters and having to update yourself?
Not frequently. I think a couple of times that happened. And I didn't really worry about that part because I knew that I would have good editors following behind me, so that if I did inadvertently use an old name for a god instead of the newer name, or something along those lines, an older term for a weapon or a magic, a spell or something. I knew that I would have people coming along who had a very keen idea for that. So I tried to do the best I could, but I didn't allow that to, if I was writing, I didn't say, oh, I got to look up the name of the spell, and then spend 2 hours doing that. But I just wrote through it, put a little question mark in there, and made sure that, it was double-checked along the way to make sure I was using the right term for the age that I was in. But I don't read, to tell you the truth, that was, I think, surprising. I was surprised at how little of that I really needed to worry about. There weren't as many of those kinds of changes as I had expected, or at least I didn't happen to be writing in areas where there were as many of those kinds of changes as I'd expected.
So let's talk a little bit about Henrik, the main character in your story. Is he original? Is he new to this world, kind of like how how Anton was in the previous one? Is this another original character for the Forgotten Realms?
Yes, yeah. Cleef and Arietta and Joelle are all new with the Sentinel and new to the Forgotten Realms as of Sentinel. I think that I'm working on a book now where Cleef will appear again. So he and Arietta and probably a couple of other characters that were in Sentinel will also be coming back.
Well, that's awesome. That's one thing that actually seems to be a common theme in this. It started with Bob Salvatore, where they mentioned how they were either going to finish these characters or wrap them up, and then they wrote the Sundering, and they suddenly realized they liked these characters so much they want to write more, because his Sundering book was going to be the last Drizzt book, and then he decided he liked Drizzt so much because of that he got reinvigorated and decided to write more. Yeah. So did you find this come back to be so? So you like it so much that you want to write more with these characters, so to speak?
I enjoy them. When you write a character, I think it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult for me, anyway, to write a character that I didn't love. And so once I've written a character once, I tend to want to come back and rewrite them or write them again and again and again, which is frankly why Malik was in the Sentinel. I just had so much fun writing him in Crucible, the Trial of Cyric the Mad, that when I realized I was coming back to the Realms, I had to find a way to get him back. back in the story, even though, you know, the last time he had appeared was 100 years earlier.
So, I guess we're gonna. My listeners really like knowing, you know, inspirations and then, you know, how people got involved in writing. So, we're gonna backtrack quite a ways right this second. How did you first get involved in the Forgotten Realms? How did they first approach you? Was it, you know, you said Bob called you to have you come back, but did, you know, Greenwood approach you? How did you first get involved in that series?
In the Sundering series, or in?
Well, like earlier, like we'll get to this. How do you get involved in Sundering? But how did you get involved in the Forgotten Realms to start with when you started your 12 or 14 book run?
Okay, well, my first book was Waterdeep, and I guess I would have to go back and just kind of give a brief recap of my career, which was that I went to work for TSR, which of course published Dungeons and Dragons, in 1981, fall of 81. And worked as a game editor and a game designer. And I had wanted, you know, I'd gone to college knowing that I wanted to write novels. And so I'd worked for TSR for, I don't know, a couple, 3 years. They came out with Dragonlance, the novels for Dragonlance, and they were very successful. And they decided they were going to do some Forgotten Realms novels. They did, I think, Darkwalker and Moonshade, Greg Niles series, and Halfling's Gem, Bob's book. And then they were going to do the transition from first edition AD&D to second edition AD&D, and decided that they wanted to, for the Forgotten Realms, explain that transition in a story term. And that was the Avatar series. And they knew that I was interested in writing fiction, and so they invited me to audition. And basically what that was that I wrote an outline for a story based on, you know, they said, meet these plot points. And I wrote an outline showing how I would meet those and submitted a sample chapter. And I think I guess about 20 or 30 people did that. And I happened to be one of the people that was chosen in a, you know, kind of a blind audition process to write for that. And my book happened to be the third one. I always seem to get the last book in the series. Happened to be the third one in that, which was Waterdeep. And that's how I started writing in the Forgotten Realms. I auditioned 2 more times in the similar process for the second book, Dragonwall, which was part of the, what was it, Horde trilogy. And then the Part C, which was the beginning of the Harper's series. I did the same audition process for all 3 of those.
So, question about this audition process. For audition, basically you write like a summary, or you write like a character, and then they say yes or no, or is it like you actually have to give them like a full-on storyline for a book?
You'd have to give them an outline. Basically, they had pretty stringent requirements. They wanted a chapter-by-chapter outline, which is a little bit rare. You know, I don't outline that way anymore when I for the publishers. When you tell the publisher what you want to do, you know, the outline runs probably 15 pages, but it's just a description of what the story will be, as opposed to breaking it down and doing it chapter by chapter, which shows how the story is going to be shaped, where the climaxes are going to be, and that kind of thing. So that was what they wanted. They wanted chapter by chapter outline, which was a pretty rigorous process. And I think the chapter by chapter outline ended up being 10 or 20 single space pages. And then you wanted to do a chapter that was like another 20 pages of your writing sample, you know, just give us a sample chapter. Essentially give us the first chapter of the outline that you've written. And that's how they would do the audition processes. And then they would take your name off of them and make sure that there's no identifying marks on it and give it to them. They would number it and pass it around to, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 editors. I'm not really sure how many they used, who would read through the stuff and select the ones they liked best. And then those are the ones that they would ask to write the actual books. It was an interesting process. I don't, you know, it's not the way writers are usually chosen anymore, but at the time, for the circumstances, because TSR had a fair number of writers in-house who wanted to write novels, and they also had a lot of talented writers out-of-house who wanted to write novels. And when they had a situation where they knew that they wanted a certain set of novels written on a certain topic, the only fair way that they felt they could do it was to do this blind audition process.
So when they brought you back in for the Sentinel, did they ask you to audition for it? Because you said Bob called you, or is it more they said, we want you to come back to the realms, here's what we have?
Yeah. No, my auditioning days are long behind me. They basically, I hadn't written for them because I'd been writing Star Wars since, as you say, 2002. And basically, I guess the story is that Bob and Ed got together with Mike Merles and some other people from WotC at a Gen Con one year, and they talked about what they needed to do to revitalize the realms. And Bob and Ed said, well, we want to, do this story. We want to bring on, some writers, and they gave them a list of writers who they wanted to contact or that they thought would be good, I guess. And the first I heard of it was probably 3 or 4 months later when Bob Salvatore called me and asked if I would be willing to go out and talk to folks at WotC about an interesting project. And, first, Bob is a great guy, and I owe him about 1 million favors. And plus, it's, it was mysterious enough to tickle your fancy, so I said I would go. And I went out to this initial conference, and by the time we were finished, it was like a 3-day conference, and by the time we were finished, I was so excited about the story that I was going to write that I was like, yeah, I got to find a way to make this fit my schedule. So that's how I became involved with writing the Sentinel again. It was not so much an audition as an invitation, I guess, would be a better way of thinking of it.
Okay. And was the reason you stopped writing the Realms before, was it mainly just because you started writing Star Wars books and they just kept giving you more and more to write, or was it you needed a break and so writing Star Wars is an awesome break opportunity?
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit of both. I'd written, I think, at that point, 20 novels for TSR and WotC. And as you said, I think it was like 15 of them were Forgotten Realms. Probably not 15. I had Dark Sun, 5 Dark Sun, 1 Planescape. So probably 14 of them were Realms novels.
Yeah, Sentinel is your 15th according to Wikipedia.
Okay. Yeah, that would be about right. So I've written quite a few for the Realms, and the Star Wars, I've been a Star Wars fan forever, from the time I first saw the movies. And the opportunity to write novels for that was, of course, great. And when that took off and went so well for me, I wrote Star Wars novel after Star Wars novel. I think I've written 12 of those now. It was pretty intense. Writing Star Wars can be a very intense experience, and when you're involved in the kind of big multi-book projects that have a lot of coordination, as the majority of my Star Wars work has been, it takes a lot of time. It probably takes, I guess, with all the extra coordination, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it takes twice as long as writing a novel that you don't have that kind of coordination to do. So as a matter of have a lot of other things to do, and could use a break away from Forgotten Realms for a while.
So I know Forgotten Realms has a huge fan base. Star Wars, of course, has a huge, very rabid fan base. After a while dealing with Star Wars fans, do you find it a relief to go back to Realms fans, or are they both very similar in their, how fervent they are as fans?
Boy, that's a good question. And I think that's a tough question to answer, because over the period of time that I've been involved with both Forgotten Realms and Star Wars, I think the whole nature of fandom has changed along with the whole nature of the internet. And Forgotten Realms fans when I first started writing Forgotten Realms, and for many, many books into it, you know, your fans wrote to you on actual paper. You know, you'd get a pile of letters, and then you would answer the letters, you know, just the old-fashioned way through snail mail. And slowly, you know, as the internet slowly kind of came into being, it transferred to there and became more convenient for everybody to interact. So I would say about the time that I started writing more Star Wars than Forgotten Realms, I'd say that's about the time that the internet forums and fan sites really kind of took off. And so it's hard to say, you know, to compare the Star Wars fans to the Forgotten Realms fans. Like, I couldn't really do it on an orange-to-orange basis, just because I think that I was involved with the two different fandoms at two different times. Like I say, you know, they're both great fandoms. They're both very enthusiastic and vocal, and I've learned a lot from listening to both of them. It'll be interesting. You know, I'm just starting to get the pre-reads on Sentinel posted, so it'll be interesting to see how the Forgotten Realms fans react to my return. But I hope that they'll like it.
Yeah, so far they've been rather optimistic and happy that you're returning. I've seen lots of, you know, people very, very, very satisfied that you're returning to the realms, but I'm assuming you're probably waiting for April, when you're going to start getting the massive wave of user reviews and insight and so on. And are you a little nervous?
Well, of course, you know, you've been away from something, and you've been away from the Forgotten Realms for a while, and the Forgotten Realms has changed in that while you were away, and while I was away, and fandom itself has changed while I was away. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is, and whether the love is there. But you know, the love is there on my side. I enjoyed writing the Sentinel, and I'm really enjoying writing the book that I am working on now.
So are you excited for what's to come in the next edition of D&D, what the Sundering is preparing everyone for? Are you excited for the opportunities that I'm assuming only you know what's coming? Well, you and the other authors. But are you excited to show that to the fans in the coming years?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's going to be a lot of interesting, cool things going on. D&D Next is, I really like the way they approach that in terms of really taking their time trying to make sure that they gave fans something that worked for them, something that the fans wanted. So it'll be interesting to see how the reception for that develops, and interesting to see how the reception. I think that I can say that the reception for the Sundering itself seems to be pretty good so far.
Yeah, I agree. Everything I've seen is pretty much every book is, oh my goodness, this is the best Forgotten Realms book in so long.
Yeah. So let's hope that will carry through from the Sundering to the post-Sundering novels, which the ones that I am aware of are pretty cool novels, and I think build on the characters and the foundations that we laid in the Sundering very nicely.
Okay. So I have a couple questions to wrap up, but there's two of them that a fan asked me to ask. I think they'll fit in here just fine. They wanted to know how your work with TSR as a game designer and developer, well, game designer, I should say, how that affected you writing in the realms. Did it, coming from a game side, how did that change your perspective when writing in this universe, if at all?
No, that's a good question, and it's one that the answer is a bit counterintuitive, because when you're writing and developing a game world, you're trying to cover all of the possibilities and put things in there for everybody, so that you try to be as inclusive as you can. You cover every corner of the world. You cover all of the different classes and so forth, and you allow the readers or the players to choose from that massive amount of detail that you've generated to tell their own stories. But when you're writing the novel, actual process is a little bit the opposite, where you only want to focus on the narrow, very small amount of detail that contributes to your story. Because if you start going over, to this city just to go over to that city, the story kind of loses its focus and loses its way. So I think the biggest thing that happened for me as a game designer and an author is becoming aware of the flip side of that coin. How as a game designer I'm trying to do one thing, which is almost exactly the opposite of what I'm trying to do when I'm a novel writer. One thing where it would help, being the game designer did help a little bit, was obviously I was very familiar with the world, so I had a vast amount of background material that I could draw on without too much trouble of, without having to pause too long to go do the research, because I knew it. I'd been involved in editing it and playing it and play testing it and so forth. And so that helped a lot, and obviously I knew how the magic worked, and knowing that allowed me to write some of the magic system into the stories. Although you have to be careful, because you do too much of that, it becomes cumbersome, and it becomes more about casting the spell than the character who is doing the casting of the spell.
Excellent. So again, I'll repeat it. It comes out on April 1st. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically anywhere you can buy books. And it's book 5 of The Sundering, and this is author Troy Denning. So anything I can say to farewell to the fans as we wrap this up?
Well, it's nice to be back and well met.
It's great to have you back, and the book is excellent.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And have a good day.
All right. You too, Jeremiah.